This particular time, I was involved then with the care of the old blue cow that we had, a family cow. Each of the boys, I guess, in turn, as long as she lived, inherited the task of milking her, and my next older brother Tom, passed this on to me just as rapidly as he possibly could. As soon as my hands were big enough to milk a cow, and I was in the process of taking care of that cow while Dad, I think he laid about 10 days in bed there. Exactly. Very sick. The stroke, of course, made him entirely immobile, and for some reason or another, he tried on several occasions to communicate with me. We just never had been very eye to eye. I stood in awe of him, or fear, or whatever it was. I was 9 years old.
And you never did get to know him. That's the whole thing.
But Mother called me in and she said, son, Dad's pretty sick. I don't think he's going to live. You ought to come in and see him. And he was comatose, mouth gaped open, inhaling. Just, it was a tremendous job for him to breathe. In fact, he was drowning in his own fluid, is what he was doing. The lungs were filling up. And I just couldn't stand it. I had to turn and run from the room. And the only thing I could think to do was to take the milk bucket and go to the barn and milk the cow. This was something I could keep myself busy. And I'd barely gotten started when I think it was Brother Gib was home. And he came out and he says, you better come in the house. And in that few minutes, why, Dad had died and they were in the doctor had arrived. He was there. And they were in the process of putting the body in some condition so it would relax and be in some form when the mortician came to get them. But it was a pretty sad occasion. Mother was particularly beside herself. I hadn't realized the affection that existed between the two of them. I never had seen any exchange very much. Wasn't aware of it if I did. But she was quite beside herself. And for many, many weeks after the funeral, every time she would prepare some food, and we'd sit at the kitchen table. Tom and Russ were still home, Francis and myself, and she couldn't contain herself to sit at the table with us to eat. She would start to cry and have to leave the room, and this went on for quite a little while before she ever got composed. You and Joe were back and forth during that period.
See, Joe and I weren't married yet, and Mother had told me, that Dad was sick, so I came down, and she needed some things like a hot water bottle and some things from the drugstore, and I had to go to Sugar House, so I had to walk to 48 South and take the streetcar and go in, and I went in and talked to Dad. This was before he'd had his stroke. He was in bed. And the last thing he ever said to me was, well, he used to call me Judy all the time. Jude or Pidge or Mary, but it was usually Jude. And he said to me as I was in there, and I said, now I'm going over to Sugar House to get some things that Mother needs. And he says, Judy, am I going to live to see Joe, my son-in-law? He was crazy about Joe. Joe and he just got along famously. And he just, that's the last word. When I come back home, he had his stroke and he couldn't talk anymore. But he would try so hard to explain something to us, and he'd point at the different pictures, and we'd question him, and it wouldn't be right. Now there's where I could say the word, because he said it himself, the bad word. I can say it's so easy, but I won't say it. But he was trying to explain Mother something, and he said that word just as plain as could be, because he couldn't hear.
For posterity, you better say the word, because we've heard it and they won't know what you're talking about.
Well, he struggled and pointed to every picture and tried to, and he just was so disgusted, and he shook his head and he said, oh shit. And that was the only word he said after that came out of him, and he'd had his stroke then. But I wasn't there when he died. I was in Park City.
Probably the next interesting or important event for you and for me too. Not long after that, you were married in the yard at that same house.
Yeah, we got married in 1925, just a year later, in September.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Was that when his mom got married, or Joe's mom?
Yeah, she got married in, wait a minute, no, she got married in July, and we got married in September of the same year, 1925. Yeah, Joe had already bought some furniture, some second-hand furniture. It was Howard Hout sold out his furniture, and Joe bought that. It had been in storage for several years there before we were married. And then we got this house for Manny Kearns on the hill there, and he paid $650 cash for it.
For a house?
A house.
Was this before he started the post office?
No, he started the post office in 1920.
Okay. So right when he came back from Logan, he started at the post office.
He worked at the mill, at the Judge Mill. They gave him a job up there. And then before he went to the post office, he worked up to the King, where he pushed the ore down in, where it went down into the mill, to run through the mill. And that's the time when it all caved in on him. He was, that was in, what year would that be? We weren't married then. It was in, no, we weren't married. He was still living at home. But this happened, this ore caved in on him, and it stopped the ore, the stuff he was pushing down with. He was a great big bin, and it was full of this fine stuff, and he used big long sticks to keep it going down, and then it would go down into the mill, and the screen stopped it coming through where it was supposed to at the bottom of the mill. And they discovered something was wrong and went up to see what it was, and he was under all his pile, and his 2 feet was right against the screen top of it. And he was just about dead when they got him out. It took him a long time to bring him to. We've always blamed a lot of his sickness onto that and the snow slide.
That and the snow slide.
What was the snow slide?
The snow slide, he went skiing with Don
Taylor.
They went up on the Ontario dump one day. This was after I was married. And they were skiing down the big dump, and the snow gave way and covered. And Joe put his finger up as they went down, and he was covered all across with the fingers sticking out of the snow.
But
And
somebody
Don
just
Taylor.
see him?
The mine,
Don,
through the years, the tailings from the mine, the waste from the mine and the mill had been hauled out on a high line against the hillside, this is the railroad track, and then had been just permitted to follow the contour of the hill in the Ontario Canyon. In fact, it was the Ontario dump, Ontario number 2. And it had a tremendous snowstorm, but he and Joe used to go skiing quite a bit. He and Joe and Aki Sunstrup.
yeah.
And they were traversing down at the bottom of that heavy snow bank, and as they went by, the whole thing just slipped by. And Don got clear, but it buried Joe, and just by virtue.
Don was covered above his knees,
Yeah.
but he got himself out, and then he got Joe out. And
Those 2 near asphyxiations obviously didn't do anything.
he almost felt like it caused a lot of his illness, because he was just practically dead. When they brought him home from that snowslide, his cheeks were all caved in, he had circles under his eyes, and he just looked awful. But the day that he got in that, one at the mill slide, The 145th Field Artillery Band was coming to Park City that night to play a dance, and he was going to get off early. He worked the afternoon shift, and we was going to that dance. But of course, we didn't get to the dance. Do you know he went up and went right back to work in that thing the next day, right in the same damn place?
How did you feel about that?
But he was going
Were
back
you
to work.
already
Well, I
figured
wasn't
away?
married then.
I know, but
couldn't
you still.
It was scary. And his mother thought, oh, I thought she would die to think he tried one, but he was all right. He went back to work the next day. But I worked, Grace Thompson and I got a job one summer, waiting table at the King boarding house.
That's another picture
Huh?
on the wall.
Yes, that's the boarding house. And it was, oh, I can't remember how many men was staying up there then, a bunch of them, and all kinds, transient men they were, you know, didn't have homes. But
You can keep going. Oh,
Taylor,
it's reflecting.
Daly, Mike Daly gave us the job. They wanted somebody to go up and work for the summer. So they took us up from the old Kimball's old livery stable there, and the wagon that you went, it was a wagon, it was supposed to be a buggy, I guess, and the front seat was way up here, and Grace and I was way down here in the back seat. And going over those bumpy roads, and two giggly high school kids, you know, just giggling and laughing all the way up till we just about died. And while we went to work all right, and we had a nice room, and they was going to pay us $75 a month in our board and room. Well, my gosh, that looked like a fortune. And along comes Mrs. Daly and wouldn't let us stay. She made us quit. She said there was no place. But we wait on those men, and Grace and I, of course, giggling all the time. And there was one tall, oh, Landy, we called him Ichabod Crane. We named them all. And you'd go down the aisle with trays of steak, and he'd reach, oh, he'd be on this side of the table, and we'd be going down the aisle here. And he'd reach over and grab it and take it right out of our hands, the whole platter. And my O'Neill, Con O'Neill, caught him doing that one day, and boy, he just walked over to the table and rolled out his slick and kicked him off the hill. He was fired. But they made us go home, so I don't think we even got a half a check.
Yeah. You want to go back to the big house in Cottonwood
Yeah.
now and talk about your wedding?
Wait a second.
Yeah.
Aunt Mary's.
Will you turn it off while I go to the
Yeah.
bathroom?
About the wedding on the lawn at the big house on
Yeah.
Highland Drive.
We finally set a wedding day, September the 7th, 1925, and it was at Mother's. And she fixed a nice chicken dinner out on the lawn with just a few relatives there. And I remember Aunt Maud and Leah, and just, it wasn't a big affair. Emma Peterson came down from, no, she came to Dad's funeral. But the wedding, I walked down the stairs. There was an upstairs, and I walked down the stairs, and I had the ugliest brown dress that I have ever seen in my life. And it had a ruffle down along here, and it was brown, and I don't know, I bought it. It wasn't a wedding dress. I didn't have a wedding dress. It was a dress I had. And I didn't even have a new pair of shoes. And I had shoes maybe look something like this. But somehow or other, those things didn't matter that day. But Tom and Francis stood up with us. And who was it doing the teasing? Somebody was teasing me, and
Teasing you?
yes, when we were signing the marriage license. I don't remember who was doing that. That's too long ago. But it wasn't anything fancy, I'll tell you. And then we stayed, our wedding night, we stayed over at Gibbs' house in Sugar House. Because he had his kids up in Park City. He didn't come down to see me married. I don't believe. I think he was in Park City too. Was he there?
Who?
Gibb.
I don't remember, I think he was.
But-
Well, he was in Sugar House by that
Yes,
time.
he was there, but
Oh, I think they were there. Russ was there. Bishop Quist
yeah, Bishop Quist was
performed the
married.
ceremony, and also Ray James was among the people who were there that day. So we have some
I probably
pictures.
was more excited than I thought.
We have some pictures. But this was quite a setting. This old colonial house had
Yeah.
quite a large lawn at that time.
Still out there.
It's since been ground up with highway. They just keep moving the curb a little bit closer and closer to the house. But also in the yard were two great, huge, big walnut trees, black walnut trees. There were just two in the front yard that shaded that lawn. There was also one fruit tree. And so this made quite an interesting place for us, and the food and everything we had out on the lawn.
She had the table set out on the lawn,
And
chicken dinner.
Bishop Quist was a very congenial, kindly old fellow, and I remember how, well, he had a great affection for Mother. Everybody did that knew her. And he spent quite a little time visiting after the ceremony with you and Joe and with Mother, the rest of us. To me, it was quite a highlight because there wasn't any of us in the family that didn't think the world of Joe. He was as much part of the family as anybody could have possibly been who wasn't a sibling. He just, Dad liked him, Mother liked him,
Everybody
I liked him.
Everybody was so good to him too when he was sick. You know, all the boys tried their darndest to help him and everybody. And Tom was especially good. He'd have him come out and pour cement and that sort of thing, you know. Keep him busy, trying to keep him busy. And then Dr. Tedrow had had him build those old coops, you know, for his old relic cars, his old antique cars, and the boys went and helped him put and Joe never, his left hand, you know, with a hammer, he was as awkward as could be. He'd never built anything in his life, but he got it up, but the boys helped him put the roof on. But that's what they did to help him, to keep him busy, you know.
I think it'd be well now, Mary, to maybe move back to Park City to the Depression as it started, and things went downhill for you and Joe.
Yeah, that was in. Not well, Joe. The post office dropped in class in 1933.
Yes.
And we moved down here in 36. But the post office was a second class office, and it dropped to third class. So that made it, somebody had to lose their job, you know. So Harry, Ryan, and Joe divided one job, and he worked for $50 a month. And that was when, let's see, Florence died in 32. And the kids, we separated the kids. We tried to, when Florence died in 32, we got Joe and I found this real good woman that needed a job, and she would have been wonderful with the children, to go right down the price and keep them together. That was what we planned to do and thought would be the best to do. But Chick didn't see it that way, so we had to separate them. But he died in 32. Joe he didn't lose his job, but he started in 33 and worked for $50 a month until we came down here in 1936. And he was working then for $60, 60 cents an hour. And his first check we got, the first 2 weeks check we got, was $100. That looked like a mountain. But he worked, of course, even from the time he started in the post office until he retired, he didn't get up to $5,000 a year. So see what the difference is now.
Prior to this, I was having a bad time in school at Granite, just wasn't making it, due partly to poverty, due partly to the fact that I couldn't get over the fact that Mother was gone. And Joe and Mary, I'd started school. I'd gone down to register, and the second day I went down, I just got sick to my stomach as I walked in the building. It just, well, I was just short of a nervous breakdown, I think. Didn't recognize it a second, but I knew I was sick to my stomach to try to go to that school for another year, and walked away from school, went on out home. We were living in the house that Tom and Pauline were living in. The boys had built for Mother. And that same afternoon, Mary and Joe came down looking for me. And very quietly, would you like to come to Park City and live with us? And my first reaction was, no, I don't want to go to Park City. But by about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I changed my mind. And I can't remember now, Mary, whether I called you or whether I wrote you a letter. But by the following Monday, she and Joe had come down and gathered me up, and this was at the beginning of the school year in September of 1930. And they made a home for me until Alice and I were married. And then when Florence passed away, leaving 5 children, and there's 3 of Charlie Jane's children and the 2 Buck boys, Fraser took the 2 boys immediately after the funeral. In fact, I think he took them home from the funeral, as I remember. And then Mary now has described how she and Joe just finally absorbed the other 3 children. This was a kind of a bad period, both for them and for everybody concerned. Joe
was coming, starting to be sick.
Wasn't making much money, and kids tended to be discontented, malcontent. But even after you moved on, where was it, Browning Avenue? You still had the 3 children.
10th East, I had 10.
3 children with them, and off and on, one or the other. Well, they were staying with Pauline and Tom, and they were staying with
That's where we
you.
separated them.
Finally separated, and you pretty much inherited
I took Charlie, and Marion took care of Janet. She was 3 years old, and Tom and Pauline took Florence. She was 10.
And for a while, Alice and I kept Charlie at Alice's mother's place until you got yourself reestablished down here. And this existed until Charlie joined the military in the Second World War, didn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, where would we like to go from here?
What was your mother like?
Oh boy, I wish I could describe how wonderful she was. To us, she was a saint. She had the most wonderful disposition of many on earth, didn't she?
She was an angel.
Yeah,
that's as near as I can describe her.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Her whole life was dedicated to doing good for other people.
For others, and she never did see anything wrong in anybody. You'd complain about me sputtering about somebody, no, Mary. I'll just tell you one occasion. Marion and I never got along very well. That was Gibbs' wife. And I was sputtering to Mother one day something about Marion. And, well, it was really about the Dunbars. She said to me, now, Mary, you shouldn't talk like that. And I said, well, they're sure funny. And she said, well, they probably think we're funny, too. And that's as much as you get her to say about anybody.
She was, sometimes I wondered if she was ever home, because as I became aware of being in the home, she was always off in somebody's home as a nurse, midwife, doing something for others, but she always got home in time that there was food and that the house was clean, but she was just of this nature.
She had a real count of how many babies she helped bring the world into the world, and isn't it a shame we haven't got that? I've forgotten it.
Got away
But
from her.
she brought many, many babies into the world in Park City.
Mother was very active with the church. She was the primary president, the Relief Society president, as her mother had been. Her mother, Grandma Thompson, was the president of the first Relief Society out here in Granger, and then organized the Relief Society in Park City, was the first president, as well as the primary president. And Mother followed right in line with her on these same jobs. And my first recollections of church was going to primary with Mother, and she being up on the stand and me down with the kindergarten group, whatever it was that I was in at that time. But even after we came down here and lived in the little house by the school on Highland Drive, Mother still, as far as her health would permit, was always at the neighbors taking care of someone who was sick, or someone who was hungry, or someone who was less well off than she was. In my own story, I'm at a point now of putting down on paper, for instance, one thing that happened. Down the lane from us, by this time we'd moved in a new home on Far Down Avenue, as it was called, Far Down Lane. The boys built it for Mother, but about a half mile below us there was a family of Italian people. Their name was Riva. Tremendous truck farmer he was. He rented property from Bishop Quist, who had performed the marriage for Mary and Joe, and he was a real truck gardener. Fruits and vegetables, tomatoes, potatoes of all kinds. But he had 3 children and was a widower. And he had a tendency, well, I think he made his own wine. I couldn't guarantee this, but every once in a while there would be a tendency for him to be out of control with himself, and he would fly in a violent rage and just terrorize those 3 children. Mother and I were sitting on the steps of the house up the head of the lane, and one of the Riva girls came running just as hard as she could run, screaming and crying, Daddy's killing Tony, Daddy's killing Tony. So she said, come on, son, let's go down and see what's going on. She wasn't much bigger than Mary, except a little heavier, I guess, really, was she? About the same height.
Well,
Mother.
She was taller than I am.
A little taller, but she was a roly-poly, blonde, fair-skinned gal. And trotting in that hot sun a quarter of a mile down to the Riva's place, she was just panting and gasping almost for breath. But here was this man with a piece of rubber hose just whaling the daylights out of about a 15, 16-year-old boy. He was older than I. And the girls were screaming in terror, and as Mother ran in, she quickly surveyed that thing. A buggy was sitting there in the yard with a buggy whip in the buggy holder, or the whip holder, and she reached that out and she walked to this great big 6-foot, 250-pound man, and she just started lashing the daylights out of that fellow with his buggy whip. And I expected to see him turn on her with that hose, but no way. She just lashed him around the hips and around the legs and on the arms. She never struck him in the face, but she just kept that thing going, telling him to back up, and he finally cowered up against the side of the house and hollered help. His English was very broken, very difficult to understand. But she finally calmed everybody down, had to give each of the kids an assignment to gather some water, to build a fire. She had them heat water. She made them sweep the house, clean the house, and it was a mess. My gosh almighty, the chickens were on the tables and the droppings on the floor, and that house was scrubbed from top to bottom. And in the meantime, she found some vegetables and some material and put a meal in the oven while they were cleaning, and everybody got a bath. Even Tony, well, she bathed Tony, and he was really battered. He had marks and bruises on his back and shoulders, and she found some Vaseline or some, what did we use in those days, mustard oil or carbolic salve. Carbolic salve was a standard thing, and treated these wounds and put some dressing on one or two of them. Finally got, and this took all afternoon, of course, to scrub and clean. And I did my little bit along with them, and Mother set the table, had them all sit down to the table, put the food on the table, and made the old man say a prayer. Bless the food, which of course they were Catholic. Bless us, O Lord, and all these years. The old man could remember it. He recited it, and they started to eat. And Mother just said, "Well, now you're in fine shape. Let's keep it that way." And we walked back up the house, and had been there all afternoon with this sort of thing. This kind of gives an indication both of her compassion and also her strength of character. Tremendous person. I can recite another, for instance, Mary, that you can probably confirm. When Chick James started courting Florence had divorced from Fraser Buck, and for some reason or another, Mrs. James just would not have anything to do with Florence. Just couldn't say a word. Good fodder, and every once in a while, when she suspected that Chick was up seeing Florence, or maybe he was up there, she would come trotting up to the house and just scream and holler and force him to go home. A couple of times that I was aware of, he'd just go in order to avoid the commotion. And on one occasion, in the kitchen of the house on the hill in Park City, Florence was complaining to Mother about Mrs. James, and as Mary's indicated, she was saying some rather bad words about Mrs. James. And Mother reached out and patted her on the hand, and she says, "Florence, just don't worry about it. One day she'll break bread in your home." And with that, Florence shrugged her shoulders and accepted the worst of it, and sure enough, as it got down to the tail end for this poor old lady, it was Florence that took care of her, and it was in her home, and it was in Florence's home that she finally came to finish out her days.
But I can tell you a bit about that at the same time too. See, these folks had moved down, and I was still, Florence and Russell and I was still in home in Park City. And Chick and Florence went down to visit the workmen's one night, and I was there alone. And I was waiting, Joe and I was going to a show, and I was waiting for him to come, and she happened to come up with a cotton on the door. She was a little bit of a fixer, Mrs. James was, real slight and small. And I opened the door, and it was her, and boy, she was just giving me what for about Florence, just, I can't tell you, I can't remember anything she said, and she had stepped inside the door. And I just picked her up bodily, and I set her out on the porch, and I said, "Now you go down home, and don't you ever come up here again." And I was shaking. Oh, and I had to go to work, too. I was night shift at the telephone office, and I had to go to work. Florence wasn't home yet, and I was afraid for her to stay home there that night because the woman was mad. She was like a crazy person when she got mad, and I was madder. But I just put her out of the house, and I called Florence up and told her, and they came home. And I made Florence go to work with me that night down at the telephone office. I was afraid for her to stay there, for fear she'd go up there and harm her. But why she detested her so, I don't know, because, my gosh, she was just like Mother as far as being lovable and kind and good-hearted to everybody, But she had it was because she didn't want her to marry Chick. But anyway, she did it in the end, like Jim says.
Well, after going back now and pick up your story, Mary, you lived in several places, apartments.
Here in
Joe
Salt
was
Lake.
starting to get sick. But you tell us about coming into this little home.
Oh. Let's see, we first lived in the apartment up over the Sterling Furniture there on the corner in Sugar House. And that's when I finally took all three, that's when I finally took all three of the children while I was there. Then we moved, first we moved down into an apartment on 21st South. And Joe was real sick then, he was awful miserable. Now, what I've lost my thought again.
Well, you were going to go, you moved again from that apartment down onto...
Oh, we bought this little house on 10th East, that was it. And we moved down there, and that's when I had all three of them. I finally took all three of them. And Florence still went to Granite. And of course, Charlie and Janet went to the great Emerson School just over a block from us. And let's see, what was it you wanted me to tell you?
Well, just as you made transitions there and finally bought this place.
Yeah, coming to this home. Well, Joe just kept gradually getting worse, and finally, the children, Janet, of course, was when Gilbert died. I took Janet, and of course I had Charlie, and Florence wasn't getting along very well with Pauline, so I took her to this one, and then I had them all three when we lived on 10th East. And he was just awful poorly. And we sold that. We didn't have much equity in it. We hadn't been there long enough. And we bought this little place. And we moved in here on November the 1st in 1940. So it's just 42 years since we moved in.
How much did you pay for it?
We paid $2,850 for it.
On a 10-year contract.
And we paid $25 a month at first. And then the man that built it, when I went to the bank to make the monthly payment one time, and he turned the heat down, please, Al. Went to the bank, and he said, Mr. Nowlin is very, very sick, and if I were you, I'd make some other arrangement about your contract of paying for this house, because he's not going to live, and if you leave it as it is, you're going to be in a big mess, because there'll be a big estate. He'll leave a big estate, and it'll take years to get cleared of it. So Joe went to the credit union in the post office and got the money, and we borrowed $300 to pay down on it, and then we was going to pay this $25 a month. Then when the bank, we turned it over to the credit union, and they fixed it up so that it only cost us $18 a month, and that's the way we paid it off. And it didn't seem like it took very long, because it was only in the first place, minus the little more than we paid $300 down. And we had that $300 to pay down, besides the $25 a month, and his check didn't amount to a hill of beans. So it was kind of a...
Do you even know what the interest rates were then?
Oh, about, let's see, what were they? It didn't get up to 6%.
5.5%.
Yeah, something like that.
No, the house hadn't been fully finished.
No.
I took it in an unfinished.
It was unfinished, and it was built for, this chimney, the house was built for a coal furnace, is what it was built for. And that little window down in the basement, or in the garage, was to been the coal chute. And when we went to Wendover in 1942, Jim Manallis moved in here, and he took the heater. We had a heater, an oil heater, sitting here on the floor. And we'd have to take a 5-gallon can and go and get, every time we needed oil, go down on 17th South and 2nd East, I remember. And the oil would spill all over and the stinking stuff, oh, I hated the smell of it. It sat here on the floor, and then when I moved here, Jim moved it downstairs and made a furnace out of it. And put in the vents and the registers.
Tom, of course, my brother Tom was working for the gas company, and he lent a hand on that sort of thing. And Tom actually had helped you with some of the interior painting and finishing. I think I got involved with some paper hanging before.
Yes. There wasn't any painting done or anything. It was just the plaster walls, you know. And we didn't have, we sold our house in Park City for $900. 4 rooms, completely furnished, good furniture, nice furniture. For $20 down and $20 a month. So he didn't have much to go on. But they got it paid off. Ken Ryan bought it. You remember Ken Ryan.
Shortly thereafter, you weren't here very long until you and Joe both went out to Wendover.
Yeah,
This was during the Second World War.
Yeah, we went to Wendover, and we went out there just to stay a few months, and we was there 3 years. And he really helped to set up he really set it up because he was the only one that had ever had second class
Post
office experience. And so he set up the post office out there, and it grew from nothing out there to 20,000 men overnight. And busy, oh dear me, it was busy. And we had barracks. We just lived in old barracks. First we lived in trailers that the government supplied us, 26-foot trailers. And we had the one bathhouse and the washroom away from it. Everybody, you'd have to go and take a shower, and where everybody else took a shower, you had your turn, you had to watch for your turn. And we lived there until they got these cinder block houses built, and then we were some of the first. But we paid $24 a month to rent that from the government, that trailer house. And we worked like Trojans, and they just worked straight time, didn't get extra overtime, just worked straight time. Lord, some nights we was there till 12 and 1 o'clock with working there. That was really an experience. And they worked so hard, all of them.
When Mary and Joe went out there, and I'd gone to work for the government war service in July of 1942, and the first 3 months that I worked, first 3 months I worked, it took me to the Presidio of San Francisco and Fort Lewis, Washington, and back to here, and then 2 or 3 temporary duty assignments. I've even forgot the names of the Army bases, but they were on the coast, Central California coast. But when I came back in September, about the 1st of September, near there anyway, they gave me a permanent duty station here at Fort Douglas, which couldn't have been nicer for me. It could have been anywhere, but I ended up here in Fort Douglas. And so Alice and I made arrangements with Mary and Joe for us to assume the responsibility for the house. And I think all we did with you was just pay what your payment was on your note, as far as I can remember. I think we did. We took care of that whatever it was they were paying on this house. But I need, and I don't know if many of the family have known about this, but as we moved in, the dirt was still piled up from the excavation here. rocks and boulders, and everything was in one pile, and what little topsoil, which was mostly hard clay, it put put in another pile. No, well, the front end of that, some little bit of leveling. I think the front sidewalk was in, just one from the steps out to the street.
Yeah, probably that was in.
So my brother Tom borrowed a team of horses. And I went out one morning early and walked the horses in from out in Cottonwood to their home there where Tom was living. And Tom put a Fresno scraper and a plow in his gas company pickup truck and brought them here and dumped them off. And he'd come and gone long since, and I wandered in with the two old plugs walking 5, 6, 7 miles from out in Cottonwood. And when I hooked up to the plow and the scraper, I didn't know how to begin with. I'd seen it done, but I had never done it. And we had two old horses that had no idea what I wanted to do and didn't want to do it anyway. And pretty soon we were always, every time we'd make a turn, we'd have to take time to undo the tugs and put them back up. So I finally talked to your mother to come out onto the pile of dirt to steer the horses. And she'd never steered a horse before in her life either.
That close to one.
The idea was we'd go around in circles, moving stuff from one place, picking it up and dumping it in another until we could just gradually level out this whole yard. And about every time your mother would pull the line, it'd pull it the wrong way and the horses wouldn't understand, and they'd turn right around where they were and look right back at me trying to hold the scraper or the plow, whatever the case may be. Finally your mother gave up in tears, and maybe with some harsh words from me, I'm not sure, but anyway, we finally got this pretty well leveled out. But there were 3 or 4 of the military, the non-commissioned officers, well, they were all non-coms, who worked with me at the fort. I was the only civilian in a military organization up there. They were called service command units, and these fellows just really would do anything for me or for us. And soon pipe came along, water pipe, steel water pipe, iron water pipe, and pretty soon it would be installed, and we ran a makeshift of a sprinkler system out here, at least a tap far enough out that we could put a hose. We graded the upper part of this, the east side of this lot back here, and made a garden out of it, and then put some grass seed at the back, enough to keep ourselves out of the mud, and got the seed out in front here growing. In that same period, we bought some rose settings, some beautiful roses. And among them was a couple of climbers that you kept going for a long time out here on the fence line after that. But with the completion of the war, I don't know how long you were out in
Wendover?
You came in before the war was actually over, didn't you? Did you come back in?
We came in 45.
No, that was just as it was over. And knowing that they wanted the house, we made arrangements to move back out and move out on Walker Lane and live in on a kind of an estate in the cottage at the back end of the lot. And at the same time, I was negotiating with Preston Pond to go to work with the Boy Scouts of America in Logan, so that it coincided pretty well for Mary and Joe to come back and take over their house from us and for us to move to Logan. And that's a different story. We ought to go back and let Mary tell some more of hers from that point on.
Yes, I was sitting here thinking of something I was going to tell you, and I found you. Going back to what was it? Oh, I wanted to tell them about, this is going way back to when I went to Yellowstone again. Aunt Mel took me. She had asked Florence to go, and Florence didn't want to go. So she asked Mother if I could go, and I wanted to go, so it was me that got to go. And Uncle Huddy we had to get, I had to have a few new clothes, and I had a sailor hat, a white sailor hat, bless your soul, with fingers down the back. Boy, I was all dressed up going on the train. Well, Uncle Huddy got the transfer from the old Kimball Ranch to, there's no clock over there, it's over here. Yeah. Now my thoughts going, damn, that's awful.
You were dressed up with new clothes on the train.
Oh, Uncle Huddy had the transfer, and these old broken-winded horses come and get us to take us down to the train. And we were sailing down Main Street, clippity-clop, the horses, you know. And they were broken-winded. You could hear them breathe all over town. And my hat blew off. My beautiful new hat went sailing back up Main Street. Well, they stopped the horses, and Uncle Huddy got out and looked back and recovered my hat. And then we went on to the train. We took the train, and we got off at Sugar House, and we met Aunt Mel and Aunt Maud, Aunt Mel and Aunt Maud. No, and we went from Sugar House to the depot to go to Ashton. And they didn't buy tickets for Leah and I. Now, Leah, I'm 2 years older than Leah. And I was short and fat and black and dark skinned. Leah was a tall, skinny girl. And blonde as anything you ever saw. And they put us, when they got their seats on the train, they put us on the floor. They had a couple of pillows. And they put us on the floor in front of our heads with our feet. And our feet up in front of the front seat. And that's the way we used to sleep that night. And along comes the conductor, you know, to collect the tickets. And they hadn't bought us the tickets. See, we was past 6 years old. I think we were supposed to have tickets. But anyway, I can see that old conductor. He was a heavy-set man, and he had his glasses like this down on his nose. And he looked down at us down there, and Aunt Maud and Aunt Mel, they said, oh, they're twins, and they're not 6 years old. Here I was black as Toby, and she as pale as anything. And he just shook his head and went on, so we didn't pay any fare. I meant to tell that when I was telling about this.
What did families do in the evenings when you were young?
Well, it was before Jim's time an awful lot. We used to sing an awful lot together. Mostly church songs, you know, hymns.
Did you have a piano or just...
No, we had no music at all.
When did the player come into the house?
Well, Florence bought that after we moved up on the coffee house. And we never did have any music before that at all. But we sang a lot, and we kids, and we didn't have electric lights, you know. We had lamps. And that was one of our jobs. The girls had to keep the coil oil place filled and clean the lamp shades.
I was never aware of it, but I've heard stories that Dad played a mandolin.
That's news to me, because I never remember it. So if he did, it was
unfounded rumor, right?
It might have been before my time, but I never really did. But he could sing. He could sing, and Dave could sing, and Florence could sing, and Russell could sing, and I could sing. I always sang alto. And when we got down to Frances wasn't even born then. It was before her time. But we sing, and then we got playing cards. We played cards. And boy, many a time we get quarreling, how kids will over cards. Mother'd come along, she wouldn't say one word. She'd just go along and gather up the cards, lift the stove lid, and put them in and burn them. She'd done that to many a deck of cards, because we quarreled. But that taught us if we don't play cards, we had to behave ourselves. But she picked them up, not say a word. In the stove they went. Burned. Darn quick, because the range was right handy.
When you went to school, was it a lot of grades together, or?
No,
or
not
all
after I
separate?
started only when we lived on the river. That was the only place where we had all the grades together. And that was, I wish I could remember what year that was. I think it would be about 1912, 1915, somewhere in
I
there.
was born in 1913,
Yeah,
so it'd be the
you
week
were-
before that.
Yeah. If you were the baby. I've been trying to place who was the baby.
Me. But not up there.
No.
You'd come back into Park City when I
Yeah,
came
yes.
on, and Francis
I know.
has no recollection of the
Frances has no recollection, so she,
pig farm.
now she was born in what, 1907.
So it had to be
It
before
had to be before that, because I was just a little short kid. Because raising the pigs, we had to herd them down through the corn patches. And we sang always. We would be in a long trail, and I brought up the rear because I was the shortest, and we'd sing, and Jimmy Burns, till the time he died, he'd comment about those, the way we sang when we lived on the river, those pigs. When we was herding pigs, and one was a little runt, and mother just wrapped it in something and put it on the oven door and raised it. That's what we did with Jim when he was born. Wrapped him up. He was almost a throwback. He was
Hardly worth keeping, huh?
He was. It was a fact. He was so scrawny and not
Throw the baby out with the water.
He was just so skimpy. It was terrible. Couldn't change to do anything. And I was 10 pounds when I was born. So I was full grown. But Gilbert was 12 pounds. Now, of course, this is just what Mother's told us. But he was born here in Salt Lake, and why, I never did know. She must have been down here for some reason, or Mother's or something. We used to, before Grandpa and Grandma left to go to Idaho, it was such a joy to have them come and visit us. And the two of them, was about 500 pounds. And
Thompson?
we had, yeah, this is our grandparents, Thompson. And we had a couple of chairs like that, captain chairs. And I remember I'd sit down in one of those and Grandpa would come and make out like he was going to sit on me, and squash me. And he used to teach us, he taught us to count in, this was long before your time, but he could have taught you later, but he used to teach us to count in up to 10 in Danish. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I can't say it anymore, but I used to know it real well. But he'd sing to us in German, and he had the most beautiful handwriting. Oh, why we didn't keep things like that, I don't know. He and Florence carried on correspondence for years. But I remember well the day they drove away from our home and left to go to Idaho. White top wagons and horses.
Covered a wagon loaded for everything, with everything they owned, and headed for southern Idaho.
Yeah.
Of course, that
Dry
was before
farm.
my time.
Dry farm,
Homestead?
homestead.
Probably Homestead. I'm not sure, but other members of the Tanner family were up in there. There was a direct relationship of the reason to go. At least I concluded that there was, because other members, other Tanner family members, were indicated as being born in Farnham at about the same time or prior to when Grandma and Grandpa would have gone up there. So there was some family connection that took them
There
in
was
that
only
direction.
about 3 or 4 houses there. And now it isn't even on the map. They've taken it right off the map. But they lived there. That's where they lived when he died. They lived there a lot of years, quite a few years. Snow up around their ears every winter. And she going out and helping babies be born, and driving in sleighs, and oh boy, what a rugged life. We'd think we were killed if we had to do some of the things they did.